On behalf of victims who suffer child sexual abuse at the hands of the Scout Association of Ireland, currently Scouting Ireland, and in foot of Mr Ian Elliott's review into its mishandling of sexual abuse and the subsequent cover-up of these actions, we of Scout abuse survivors wish to make the following statement. As victims and survivors, we have suffered for decades and found getting from one day to the next an ordeal, almost not worth the effort at times, but we did. And the multitude of other victims who still struggle, and of course those who could not continue that struggle, who took their own lives. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that this report is of no use to us. As outlined in his document described herein as a learning review, its purpose is to learn from past mistakes in the mishandling of offences committed against children in its care, and to act on introducing measures to correct those mistakes. Quote, "The intention is not to allocate blame to specific individuals, but to fully acknowledge the mistakes that have been made previously with a view to drawing learning from them." End quote. Firstly, we would like to point out that abuse of a child through gross indecent sexual assault and covering up this crime is not a mistake. It is indeed a criminal act. The sexual assaults carried out against us as children has left us with lifelong scars and reduced our ability to cope on a daily basis with life on life's terms. Horrific recurring memories, childhoods lost forever, struggles with depression, anxiety, hypervigilance and endless morbid rumination, social anxiety disorders, self-harm, self-destruction and self-sabotage, to put labels on at least some of our struggles. To refer to these crimes and subsequent cover-up and to reduce this criminality to such mundane terms as to describe them as a mistake is indicative of how reductive this whole review is, which upon examination would seem to be its sole objective, given that there is nothing new in this learning review. Covering up these crimes is not a mistake. It's subverting the course of justice and enabling the criminality to continue and thrive, which is what has happened. And secondly, introducing measures to prevent further mistakes being made will go nowhere to restore the trust already lost to Scouting Ireland. Accountability in seeking justice is indispensable. Accountability is the one thing distinctly absent from this learning review, and as it turns out, accountability is the only worthwhile objective that this review could have offered its victims. Unfortunately, it has utterly failed in that regard. There are no statutory measures in this review or provision for sanction of any kind for past crimes against children, either from within Scouting Ireland or from law enforcement. It's explicitly stated that there is no intention to find the perpetrators in an organisation that has freely admitted that it was controlled in part or in whole from the top down by paedophiles. This learning review is founded upon volunteered evidence and is subject to volunteers' willingness to provide evidence as they choose. To exercise their own prerogative on volunteering that evidence or not, they may include or exclude evidence as they deem fit. It's stated by Mr Ian Elliott that some were withholding information, who decided for themselves that evidence that they had was not necessarily material to this review. This assertion and many more throughout is evidence of a cover-up. Not just covering up any crime, but covering up the worst of sexual crimes against vulnerable children. Quote, "Some of those that contributed provided only a limited amount of information and had more to tell, but did not see fit to do so within this process." End quote. This review, in its opening line, holds the notion that casts doubt on whether abuse took place at all. What is useful to know is, however, the fact that there is ample proof that sexual assaults and abuses did take place within this organisation, and is evidence in the courtrooms across the country and in Dublin Central Criminal Court on the 15th of October 2015 and as recently as on the 8th of October 2019. Predatory paedophiles who were Scout leaders were convicted and imprisoned. Prolific paedophiles with multiple victims on occasion saw prison. One in particular, David O'Brien, a man who was found guilty of sexually assaulting several boys, admitted to Garda detectives investigating as having abused 60 children in his care, some on multiple occasions. This review opens up with the executive summary stating that, quote, "This report was commissioned by Scouting Ireland to examine the incidents of sexual abuse that is believed to have happened within Scouting." End quote. From its own review, which clearly states its intention is not to assert any blame or seek any justice for any victim, it therefore once again falls upon us, the victims, without any support whatsoever, unlike the perpetrators in Scouting Ireland, to go about our way to seek justice. There is now, without any doubt, an urgent need for a full Garda investigation. into the historical abuses which were perpetrated against generations of young boys. The admission that files were not handed over, that perpetrators acted in collusion so as to act as an organised paedophile ring, and that witnesses in this review withheld information. And the fact that this type of criminality does not have a statute of limitation, and that these paedophiles are still at large, are all the reasons we deem it necessary to demand a criminal investigation. It's beyond comprehension how anyone would conduct a review into the mishandling of these cases to go out of their way to specifically exclude the appropriation of any blame or any accountability, and why all 4 offenders highlighted in this review are deceased is indicative of how toothless this report is. Mr. Adrian Tennant in his apology stated that, quote, "As Scouts, we will not hide from our responsibility to tell the truth." That was on the 7th of May 2020. This review in practice does exactly that. This truth in his review is discretionary and it's constricted for the sole purpose to fit a predetermined outcome. And it's plain to see that some did hide from their responsibility in telling the truth. We would like to know who decided to restrict this review to such narrow terms as to render it a nonsense, and why. He also states in his apology, cronyism, looking away and covering up are not victimless crimes, they are enabling actions. That was also on the 7th of May 2020. This learning review and the methodology used to achieve it is indeed looking away. Mr. Tennant also is bold enough to suggest that his document is a blunt instrument seeking to bring light into the darkest places in Scouting. I quote, "by looking beneath the stone and searching the darker corners of the organisation," end quote. It does not. Instead, it turns its back on victims. When staring into those darker corners, as Mr. Tennant so eloquently puts it, was most needed. Finally, and I quote, "This learning review is a milestone in Scouting Ireland's determination to search for the truth. It exposes past failings, particularly in our legacy organisation. It enables us to learn from an appalling backdrop of abuse, which was ignored and unfortunately, in some cases, actively covered up. Mr. Elliott's report is for them. It is their story." This is on the 14th of May 2020. End quote. I'm afraid this is not so. This is not our story. This is the story that Mr. Elliott and Mr. Tennant wanted to tell you, and did. None of those abused who were the subject of this review were asked to participate in this learning review that we are aware of. When late at night, under a canvas tent, far away from his family, a child's sleeping bag is unzipped by a predator to gratify his perverted sexual desires, he not only takes pleasure for himself, he takes all innocence from that boy, all his trust, all his joy, all his hope, all his love for life, which up to that point was in abundance in that little lad. When a scout leader takes a boy off into the woods for an hour or two to sexually abuse him, to defile him, to dishonour him, to undress him, to humiliate him, to cripple him emotionally, to make him do things he cannot possibly comprehend in his young, developing, adolescent, confused mind, what returns from those woods is no longer that little boy, but a broken child, a shadow with lifelong struggles, a tormented ghost who will spend a lifetime looking for that which was taken. And if he eventually finds what he spends his adult life looking for, often it is too late. There are many ways to murder a child, but there are ways to kill a child and leave the body alive. And that is possible by sexual abuse. A scout is trusted, a scout is loyal, a scout is friendly and considerate, a scout is a brother to all scouts, a scout has courage in all difficulties, a scout makes good use of his time and is careful of possessions and properties, a scout has respect for himself and for others. These are the promises we took as scouts, and we have only one wish, that senior staff in Scouting Ireland live up to the principles and laws they so eloquently espouse, which up to now, in this regard, they have completely dishonoured. We also call all scouts, past and present, with information to come forward as honourable, trustworthy and courageous brothers. We are, after all, still fellow scouts. To Garda Commissioner Drew Harris and Caretaker's Minister for Justice, Mr. Charles Flanagan, and Children's Affairs, Catherine Zappone, we feel it incumbent upon the Garda to open an official criminal investigation into Scouting Ireland and its legacy organisations. Not to do so is a crime. It's an affront to those who have fought long and hard for decades to get relatively negligible outcomes in the justice system, or none at all. Injustice unchecked dehumanises all in society. With all due respect to Mr. Tennant and Mr. Elliott for their learning review, it's a sincere regret that it was restricted to such narrow terms. We wish to thank Joe Duffy and Angus McNally and the team at RTE Liveline, to Robin Schiller at the Irish Independent, and to Neil Michael in the Irish Examiner, Neil Boylan in 94 FM, Philip Gallagher and Una Smith at RTE Investigates. Without you, we would still be languishing in the dark. Our thanks also to detectives Ed Carroll, Gillian Ryan, Sheila White and Deirdre McInerney for your professionalism, your sensitivity, your passion and your desire for seeking justice. It is our view that no one needs to learn how not to abuse a child. No one needs to learn how not to cover it up. However, one needs to bring justice and to punish those who do. It took some of us 40 years thus far to get justice as individuals, suffering long, hard years in silence and alone a lot of that time. Now today, together, with your help, we need justice to prevail, for our sake, for the sake of all victims, and more so, for the sake of future generations, that organisations we trust with our most valuable treasures, our children, are safe places. We hope it will not take another 40 years. Thank you.